Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. One of our viewers, Sean Afshar, thank you, Sean, asked me about the comparison between Dubai and Hong Kong. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Hong Kong versus Dubai, which one is better just in general, which is really, of course, going to be personal preference, but I will display some of the kind of pros and cons for you accordingly. So let's dive in. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button. Really appreciate your support. And if you'd like help with anything that we help you with here on this channel, please book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael.Brosmer, link in the description below, or send a message through our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. We can help you get residencies and citizenships and do international tax planning and all that kind of stuff. All right, so Dubai versus Hong Kong. Well, let's start with the most obvious starting point, which is the weather differences. So Dubai is, of course, a much more extreme climate because, as I've mentioned in many videos, the summers are unbearably hot by most people's standards. Now, the good news is it is a city set up so that you can spend most of your time inside. You know, things are well connected by malls, etc., and so you can simply avoid going out. But then again, do you really want to, right? That's a whole other conversation. So I would say that for 3 to 4 months, probably not the greatest place to live. By contrast, you know, like right now, it's fantastic. It's like perfect in the spring and the fall. You know, different people can decide what they like about the winter, but you know, in the spring and the fall, I think it's really, really good. Hong Kong, for those of you who haven't been, is a much more, I mean, it's a mild climate. It tends to get a little chilly, but not super cold. It tends to be much more rainy, much more overcast. Of course, Dubai is pretty much sunny all the time. And so, you know, you have that element of things. Then we can go and we can look at cost of living. I've mentioned before how Dubai is an incredibly expensive place for a lot of things, but Hong Kong is its own form of expensive. So in general, life in Hong Kong is not that expensive, all right? Things like food, etc., aren't crazy, but housing is nuts. So if we were to compare, housing in Hong Kong is far more expensive than it is in Dubai. In fact, if we were just to look at cities, Hong Kong is the second most expensive in the world after Monaco. So that's, you know, really high. I would say probably maybe 4 times more expensive. It also means that the way that people live is in much smaller spaces. Like, I don't think you can actually find a huge apartment in Hong Kong, whereas you can in Dubai. Dubai, you can have lots of big places, big villas, big apartments, etc. You're pretty much looking at apartment living in Hong Kong, so, you know, be aware of that. In terms of kind of the, you know, other parts of the environment, Hong Kong is actually quite green. For those of you who haven't been, it's I think like 70% green space, quite a large portion. And so that's kind of cool. It's on the water. Of course, Dubai is also on the water. Dubai is, however, in the desert. Now they're working on transforming it. You know, hopefully that will be really outstanding. I have lots of faith in their leadership, so we'll see how it goes. If we look at the overall kind of, what would I call it, the dirtiness of the city, in general, Hong Kong is much dirtier. I find Hong Kong personally to remind me a lot of New York. So if you've been to New York City, you're going to see that it's a pretty gritty place. You go down into the subways, they stink. If you're out on the streets, they'll leave trash out to be picked up. And so it's just like, it's kind of dirty, it's kind of gritty, grimy, this sort of thing. I get a lot of that feel when I'm in Hong Kong. Whereas in Dubai, it's generally very clean. Probably one of the cleanest places, just if people constantly cleaning. Everything, like, I was out the other day and just in a public mall and went to the washroom and noticed how often washrooms are disgusting. And in Dubai, it's like you go in, you use a toilet, somebody comes in immediately after you, cleans it, and that's that. Of course, not everywhere, but in a lot of places. And so, yeah, it's just much cleaner. You do have air quality issues in Dubai, but then again, you do in Hong Kong as well. So in that respect, I would say, you know, clear win to Dubai over Hong Kong. In terms of conveniences, I mean, these are both super convenient cities typically. Hong Kong is probably kind of like the original in a lot of different regards. There's just so much that it's been set up for kind of that bustle. Again, I liken it a lot to New York. It's, you know, a friend years ago kind of mentioned to me that He figured Hong Kong was the only skyline better than New York. Now, of course, you have Shanghai, you've got some other places like this, but the skyline in Hong Kong is amazing. It's very concentrated. There's a lot of bustle. It's a lot of like get things done, move, etc. I remember staying at a 5-star hotel one time and calling down to the front desk, and they answer, and I'm like, "Hi, how are you?" They're like, "Good. What do you want?" It's just like this is the Hong Kong get things done attitude, which is extremely different from Dubai. In Dubai, it's very much about like friendliness. Let's have friendly service workers. I wouldn't say that Hong Kong is not a service culture, although you do have certain cases where, for example, you can go to a restaurant where there's no waiters. You scan a QR code and a little thing comes out on a track and delivers your food to you, and this sort of thing. So you get like a little bit of that going on in Hong Kong, which is somewhat different than Dubai. That's not a Dubai thing at all. Dubai is like very much a service culture. On the other hand, I would say that the resourcefulness and getting things done of Hong Kong culture is far superior to in Dubai. It's a different culture. Culturally, Dubai is more friendly, more tourist, more all that. And Hong Kong is more business, more getting things done. I think that reflects also in the social environment of people being in Hong Kong more to work and to make money, etc., versus in Dubai where people are people are building things in Dubai for sure, but there's also a lot of kind of like tourism, and a lot of people who they've made money or they're making money and now they kind of come to Dubai as like their retreat, if this makes sense. It's kind of the place where they can escape a lot of the things they dislike in other parts of the world. Obviously, when we're talking about governments, we've got issues going on in Hong Kong now with China that is, increasingly encroaching onto how Hong Kong is run. It's kind of disturbing for a lot of people, and so, has become less attractive. Meanwhile, you have kind of the opposite in Dubai. Every year it just gets more open, there's less restrictions, etc. So although in theory, Dubai is an autocratic place, right? There's absolute power on the behalf of the monarchs. In spite of that, you're in a situation where they actually choose to have it be pretty open. Now, in fairness, Hong Kong has traditionally been really open. There's been lots of different opportunities there. So it's very specific areas in which they have encroached, but that is something to be aware of. In terms of talking about the tax system, Dubai is just incredibly difficult to beat because it's just zero tax, right? That's it, zero tax. Very, very simple. In Hong Kong, you can get favorable tax with a territorial tax system. There's no tax on capital gains. Corporate income tax is 8.25% for small businesses, and then after you exceed $300,000 a year, it goes up to 16.5%. There's a single imputation system, so if you pay tax at the corporate level, you don't pay tax at the personal level. There are management and control rules, so there's some other different things. The way their territorial tax system works is based on something called the operations test, so it's difficult to be zero tax on earned income in Hong Kong, but it's pretty easy to be zero tax on investment income in Hong Kong. So there's that. I would say it's easier by far to come to UAE than it is to come to Hong Kong. So your ability to kind of get visas is just really, really easy. Not that it's not possible by any stretch in Hong Kong, or at least in normal scenarios. For the last, we're going to exclude to some extent the last 2 years, but maybe we should look at that, right? Right now, Hong Kong's incredibly closed. It's a 3-week quarantine, no matter what, if you show up in Hong Kong today. Whereas by contrast, in Dubai, you can come and have no quarantine super easily. Basically, you have a negative PCR test, and that's pretty much it. So much, much more open in Dubai than in Hong Kong. And, we'll see where that goes over time. Really similar, I would say, in terms of banking. You have, in Dubai, a currency that is pegged to the US dollar, the dirham. Likewise, the Hong Kong dollar is pegged to the US dollar. So in both cases, pegged, pretty simple. You've got all the major international banks there. It has gotten more difficult to bank in the US in UAE, and it's gotten more difficult to bank in Hong Kong. I would say that generally speaking, at this stage, Hong Kong is probably more complex to bank than UAE, and I would say that things tend to work a bit better, at least for English-speaking people or people from the West. There are a lot of the banking online interfaces in Hong Kong that are still kind of not so great. They've improved a lot, but yeah, it's a little less favorable in that regard. But yeah, generally, it's very similar banking options. You've got lots of cards, lots of banks, lots of things like that. Generally, pretty good quality institutions. So yeah, you've got all of that. In terms of access, I mean, if you're talking about Asia, Hong Kong is really well connected. You also, of course, can fly across the Pacific and gain access to North America. It's not as well connected, probably in raw numbers, as Dubai is. On the other hand, if you want to have access to Asia, it's just way closer, right? It's not to say that Dubai is kind of a bridge between Europe and Asia. This is a little bit different. So, yeah, I think that the principal differences I would look at are it's easier to get into Dubai. There's definitely some differences in weather, and the preference is there. Certainly, you can be in Hong Kong all year round without issues. The housing situation is quite different. Then you've got, I would say, a cultural difference is probably the biggest thing that I notice. That's a piece that I would, it's quite different. And then for certain types of businesses, you need to be really aware of what you are getting from a tax standpoint, because again, it's just hard to compete with zero tax in UAE. I mean, literally it could be 16.5% tax difference on your income, which is, I mean, if you're making $1 million, that's it's $165,000 a year, right? It adds up into something, and obviously it scales one way or the other. Generally, circling back just quickly to cost of living, I would say is much more expensive on things like food in Dubai. Certainly, food imports as well. There's no import duties in Hong Kong. So generally speaking, just generally like paying for normal things aside from housing tend to be quite a bit cheaper in Hong Kong than they do in Dubai. I would say it's the same for if you're talking about something like cell phone plans, etc. All around, there's probably cheaper wages in Dubai if you want to hire certain types of people, but I probably wouldn't hire people primarily in either of these places. It's just not really that cost competitive as compared to some areas. If you can have a remote team, it's much better. And then of course, office space is going to cost a lot more in Hong Kong. And so if you have to put people in an office, then there's that ripple effect as well. So my personal preference for sure is Dubai. And I think that the popularity of Dubai is a big thing. I think that right now the problem in Hong Kong is there's a lot of uncertainty about how China will deal with it. And of course, it's been incredibly closed and restricted over the last 2 years, basically. And so we'll see what happens in the future. It's really too bad because to many people, Hong Kong, I've had people say for years, was their favorite city in the world. They thought it was just such a dynamic, amazing place. And there's so many cool people. There's so much interesting culture. It was, really fostered something pretty spectacular, pretty wonderful. And now they're, facing more issues with that. So anyway, I hope that gives you some sense. Let me know in the comments, where would you rather live and where would you rather visit, Hong Kong or Dubai? What are your perspectives on both of them? And I'm going to look forward to seeing you on the next video.